Hello and welcome to Mobile Interactions Now, the podcast where industry pros share first-hand experiences on making mobile interactions work. I'm Chris and I'm part of the team here at Tintech. On today's episode, we're joined by Pamela Clark-Dickson. Pamela is an analyst at Ovum that specializes in communications and social media. Pamela talked with Gene about her research and findings in 2020 trends in consumer communication apps. So here is part one of our conversation with Pamela. Take it away, Gene.
Pamela, welcome to the show. We did a little bit of an intro in the beginning of the show, but I'm sure our audience will want to hear directly from you. So could you just tell us who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure for me to be here on the show. Yes, I'm Pamela Clark-Dickson. I'm the practice leader of the communications and social research stream at Ovum within the consumer and entertainment services research pillar. Ovum is a business-to-business, global business-to-business research and consulting firm. We aim to provide actionable insight to our clients.
Let's just start right from there. Now, what are you lately watching really more closely as we are kicking off this new decade, 2020?
Okay, well, thank you, Jean. First of all, I would just like to say how much I appreciate you inviting me to be on this show. It's a very great pleasure for me to be speaking with you today. So what I'm watching at the moment, and I think what a lot of industry analysts are watching, there are a few things. First of all, 5G is obviously uppermost on a lot of analysts' minds. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there with regards to consumers and how they use communication services, or what sort of communication services telcos will provide for them, whether there'll be any difference. At the moment, it does seem to be no real difference. That the focus tends to be more on more enterprise-related services and on more content-oriented services like cloud-based gaming and so forth. But you know, the way that the 5G networks are going to be set up, there'll be lower latency networks. They'll enable much higher data download rates. So, you know, there is potential for, I think, new services to come in there. So related to that, you know, what are these new use cases around 5G for communications? And how does that extend into, and I know this is a topic of great relevance to Tintech, how does that extend into customer care? The expansion of commerce on communications apps is another trend that I'm closely watching at the moment. There have been, we know that in China, in South Korea, and in Japan, the use of commerce on communications apps it's well used. So, but we're starting to see, or we have seen just in the recent past, Facebook enabling commerce, various commerce-related capabilities on its Instagram, and we'll see that rolling out, I think, a bit more with Facebook Pay coming to all of the apps as well. That was something that Facebook launched towards the end of last year. So it'll be interesting to see how much consumers will use that kind of service on the Facebook suite of apps. And then finally, I guess another key area that I'm watching and have been watching for a while and want to continue looking into is this provision of a richer communications experience into customer care, whether that's app-based, as I just mentioned, or via the telco service of rich communication services. So those are the three sort of broad trends that I guess I'm watching as we go forward into the 2020s.
That sounds like a lot that is happening actually. But before we get into like sort of unpacking those, and I'm actually curious because you've been in the industry for over a decade now, and watching these things shaping up and moving forward from there. If you were to just kind of look back and see some of the trends that you thought that would be really, or the industry believed that will really take the market forward faster, that some of them came true and some of them did not, and I'm assuming. Is there anything of interesting tidbits that you want to share on that?
Sure. So I guess if I look at, I mentioned RCS there at the end. That's something that's been around for a while, and we've seen lots of a comment saying that, you know, RCS is going to be here this year, and then this year, and then this year, and it's just not really taken off as quickly as I think the telco industry would have liked, or even as quickly as Google would have liked, I think. And so we're starting to see Google and its impatience leading into things like Google Guest, where it's rolling out RCS independently of the telcos in some markets, with a view, I think, to roping telcos back in when telcos in those markets launch RCS services. So that I guess is kind of an easy one to pick for a prediction that has been a kind of a continual prediction, but hasn't really delivered as yet. I guess the other thing is, and this is sort of a broader industry trend, I suppose, and we are starting to see that happen towards the end of the last decade, where we're starting to see much more in the area of artificial intelligence and robotics. Maybe not so much robotics. It's certainly pushed forward a little bit further than it did. But AI in particular, you know, we're seeing that as another growth area. But it's I think it probably happened a little bit slower than I was expecting it, and but maybe that was just me being a little bit more optimistic about the state of you know, what was needed in order to be able to deliver on AI-based use cases. And robotics, I mean, we know that's coming along as well, but it's still, you know, much slower than I would have predicted at the beginning of the decade. So, you know, you kind of, you live and learn from these things. I think you realize that there are a lot of different parts that need to be actually established as the foundation for these technologies. And thankfully, towards the end of the decade, a lot more of these moving parts are in place. So, you know, I have an optimistic one and I have a slightly less optimistic one, I guess, with RCS in terms of past predictions that are coming true, but just more slowly than we expected. And then one which is still a little bit, we're not sure about that.
Well, that's exactly why I come to somebody like you, to get the real pulse at things that are happening, because us being in the industry, we tend to get excited, and some of but this comes in a mixed bag where you don't watch for it, then you miss those positive indicators that you could have made the difference. So now I'm anxious in terms of some of the recent studies that you've been working on,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to share some of the highlights?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, so I'd probably like to just share with you some detail from our Digital Consumer Insights survey. We run these as a series of surveys every year within Ovum. And so the particular survey that I work on is based around communications, media, and commerce. And I just wanted, I guess, to highlight some of the findings from this particular survey with regards to customer care. So some of the things that, I mean, it hasn't really surprised me, but maybe, you know, it surprises those with less of a knowledge of the industry, or less of a knowledge of the communication side of the industry, about how important, you know, a basic communication service like SMS still is as a communications channel. You know, we still, according to our survey, it's probably one of the top 3 or 4 communications channels that consumers still use to interact with their service providers. And when I'm talking about communications channels, we're looking at SMS, voice, email, web browsers, both with and without sort of agent interaction. So things like web chat, for example. MMS we still keep in there, although it's much less relevant than it used to be, even if it was very relevant anyway. And chat apps, obviously, of course, and apps as a whole. So yeah, so out of all of those, you know, SMS is still right up there as a communications channel for the moment. But, you know, it's important to acknowledge that chat apps are being used increasingly. The growth in them is increasing, not as high as some of the other channels, but it is starting to increase year on year. So, for example, If I look at the difference between 2018 and 2019, in terms of how consumers typically access customer care functions from their service providers, chat apps increased from about 9% to just over 14% in 2019, so from 9% in 2018. But then if you look at some of the communications channels, the more traditional ones, SMS unfortunately is actually declining, but not as quickly. So it went from just over 23% to about 22%. So it doesn't sound huge, but I think the overall trend is there. But we're still seeing a growth in email. So, and it's still one of the more popular channels that consumers use. So from just under 38% to just over, so in 2019. So it's things like that, obviously we need to still consider, or brands I think need to still consider when they're looking at how they communicate with their customers and how their customers want to communicate with them. But it does depend on the market in terms of, for example, if we look at chat apps in particular. So in some markets you have a very clear dominant chat app or communications apps that consumers are using. So WhatsApp, for example, in Brazil and South Africa, obviously WeChat in China, but then it's fragmented in other markets. So you might have this almost even sort of use of Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp in markets like Australia or the UK. I guess another thing that it's not surprising to me anymore, but I mean, maybe it might be surprising to others sort of within or without the industry, depending on what part of the industry that they're in, is that video calling is a very popular service on communications apps, even more so than voice calling. And so, as I'm talking to you here today, it's a video call as well, and that's coming more into the business communications market. But I think that's more than likely going to make its way into customer care as well, if not already, and become more common. So just a few of the findings, I guess, from the customer care segment of our digital consumer insight survey.
I always get so intrigued by the geographical difference, market by market, how these things change. Do you see any differences like in other aspects, meaning whether age difference or, special vertical industries? Are there any differences you see?
Well, we haven't really segmented by vertical industry as such, but with age, it is pretty much the younger demographic. I think you could say that, for example, tend to use video calling, and we do have that segmentation in our survey as well. So if I look at say, for example, I'm just going to try and do this now on the phone while I'm on the call with you. So, for example, it's video calls. Probably about 76% of consumers under the age of 24 are using video calls on apps, whereas for consumers sort of over that age bracket, say over 25. If I look at that, it's a little bit lower at 61. I mean, it's still pretty high, but we do see some of that segmentation coming in, and obviously the older the age group, the higher up that you go. Say for over 35-year-olds, it goes down to about half. So 53.4% would use video calling on their mobile phones via an app. So yeah, there are specific differences depending on what feature it is and the age group.
But this is where I'm going to ask you to, provide your insights, if not exact data, because as a consumer, I consider myself as somebody who is rather impatient, and I often find myself like picking, a brand based on how they quickly or not answering my questions, and things in that nature. And it's a split-second decision. And sometimes I kind of have this buyer's remorse later, but still at that moment of making that decision, I do really care who's going to get me the answer as quickly as I want it.
Sure.
And how do you see this happening on the consumer end? Perhaps what some of these communications channels that you described are working for or against?
Well, yeah, I think that that is very much the case, because I think as a society we are more geared towards that kind of instant gratification, and we want that instant response from the companies that we are dealing with or buying things from, or interacting from in some other way. And a lot of the technologies and channels that are coming, or that have been on the market for a while now, particularly through social media and communications apps, are enabling that kind of instant communication. So rather than sending an SMS, and I mean, you know that it gets delivered very quickly, but you might not get a response very quickly. That two-way interaction with SMS was slightly more clunky, and probably is still quite clunky today. We've seen chat apps really overtaking there in terms of how responsive a business can be to a consumer inquiry. Say, for example, through Facebook. If you have Facebook, you can send, and you're interacting with a business on Facebook, and they're using Messenger as their communications channel. You get an indication, first of all, of how long on average it takes them to respond, which is tremendously useful, and I think helps manage consumers' expectations. And I think consumers don't mind if it takes a while, as long as they know, roughly when they can expect a response. But then secondly, there is that capability for the business to respond very quickly. If you've got a number of people there on the back end that are responsible for manning the messenger, a number of admins who can manage the messenger experience, that interaction between the business and the consumer can actually be quite quick. And it's easy for consumers. If they're on Facebook, if they have Messenger, and this is just an example, because obviously there are other communications apps and services out there that would be providing similar experiences, but it's easy for a consumer as well. So that's one element of it. I think another element is in terms of when you're talking about how consumers selecting brands. Another thing that I think might be interesting just to mention is that of the impact of social media influencers now, and particularly on Instagram, for example. And I think these influencers are having, a great deal of impact on how consumers are selecting the brands that they buy and that they interact with now. So, and Instagram, and again, I know I'm using Facebook a lot as an example here, or Facebook properties as an example here, but they are probably doing the most and the most visible in this space. But they're now enabling brands on Instagram to be able to monetize that, because they're putting the commerce pieces in place as well. So, it's all of these things that I think are starting to come together as part of the selection process. You've got the what do you say, the logistical side of things, and then the emotional side of things, I suppose, if you can say that. How, once they've made a choice, then how do they get access to that product or service? And then the actual act of making the choice themselves, that itself, how do they make that choice?
It's really interesting to see how evolving the whole, what communications actually does for brand engagement. Because it used to be, I think, it was straightforward customer service. You call them, how do you communicate with them? And pretty much one way, email versus, and except when you get somebody on the phone. Now it sounds like, as you're talking about the whole logistics, this basic need to know. It's about providing the data, and all these things are coming together. Do you see the indication that consumers are aware of these things and demanding it, or is this something just technology is enabling it?
Oh gosh, that is a good question. I think it might be a bit of both. As technology does tend to go through that series of stages in the adoption process, doesn't it? We see one company starting out with a feature or a service in the market, and then it either lives or it dies by virtue of whether it, the customers of that company that have introduced the technology actually use it. And so I think the technologies, I was thinking about this earlier today in the context of this conversation that we're having, and thinking, well, consumers, when you think about it, we do tend to be a little bit lazy, I guess, as well, in terms of, we'll probably do the least amount possible if we can in terms of getting access to a product or a service. And so, if the brand that provides that to us can make it easy for us to access and, actually eliminate any barriers, then we'll probably go with that, assuming obviously there has to be other elements that come into play, like the value of the brand or the value of the product or the service. That has to come into it as well. But the actual fulfillment process, I think anything that makes life easier for a consumer, that is the kind of technology that is going to make a difference to their lives, and that will be the technology that they'll want to keep on using to interact with their brand or their service provider.
I'm curious, when you're comparing all these different chat apps, are there any apps that are doing better in terms of providing full features for, commerce ready, or to make it easier to have conversations between companies and consumers?
Yeah, sure. I think that there are probably 3 or 4. So obviously we have seen WeChat, Line, KakaoTalk, all making it super easy for their consumers to access a network of merchants and services through their platforms. And they've been doing that for a while now. What we're now starting to see is that Facebook is enabling a similar kind of capability on its platforms. And as I was mentioning to you before, the fact that businesses can have pages on Facebook, which they can then link with, say, a Facebook Messenger capability. And soon there'll be Facebook Pay as well. So we're seeing that democratization, I guess you could say, of access to a business via a social media platform or via a communications platform that may not have been there before necessarily. And I think that's probably one of the most striking things about the development of the communications app and social media space recently.
Thank you again to Pamela Clark-Dickson for joining us today. Don't forget to tune into our next episode for the conclusion of our conversation with Pamela. You can find out more about Pamela and Ovum at ovum.com. To find out more about Gene and Tentech, visit tentech.com. Make sure to search for Mobile Interactions Now in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Tentech, thanks for listening.